Hi, everyone, and welcome to News Take. I'm Rebecca Frank, VP of Research and Insights at the News Media Alliance, and your host of this podcast. As we think about the future of the publishing industry, online and off, there are very few industries that offer a comparable tale of success to aspire to as the music industry. We've all seen what music businesses have been able to do, successfully transition to a model where creators are compensated for digital consumption, and we'd love to know what's next and how to follow the roadmap they've so cleverly laid. My guest today is one of the key map makers to really torture that analogy I've laid out. Cherie is the founder of Water and Music, a research network focused on analyzing music and tech trends. Previously, Cherie penned hundreds of articles on music and tech as a freelance writer for publications including Billboard, Forbes, Pitchfork, and Variety. She has spoken as an expert commentator on CNBC and SiriusXM Volume, as a guest lecturer at institutions like Harvard, NYU, Northeastern, and Berklee College of Music in Valencia, and has spoken at over 30 conferences around the world. Cherie, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. So first of all, tell me about yourself. Did you come to the music business as a musician, just as a writer? Where'd you start?
Yeah, definitely started on the music side. So I've played piano for my whole life. I'm classically trained in piano. And so that creative and performance side of music has always been very near and dear to me. And I guess after or throughout college, I thought I was going to work on the industry side of music because I was also really into math and stats and data analysis. So I was hoping to work in like a data facing role at like a record label or a streaming service. Writing was never in the purview, at least initially. It was because of a very happenstance encounter with an editor at the first magazine I wrote for, which was Forbes, on their entertainment team. Around 2015, they just happened to be looking for more people to cover the, I guess, trends at the time in music and tech for them. That year was a very big year because I think Apple Music had just launched that year. Yeah. Amazon was just starting to really get into streaming as well. So the big tech conversation around music streaming was starting to shift. So yeah, just very thankfully I got that gig to start covering music and tech for them, and just instantly fell in love with writing as a way to grapple with a lot of the just the sheer complexity of the music industry and how money flows in the industry. So I thankfully have never left. So it's still writing editing to this day.
And I mean, personally, I'm a big believer that there need to be more writers who bring that understanding of math. So valuable in explaining some of these topics. So for our listeners who are not experts, can you give a quick high-level overview of how musicians, as well as others in the music industry who are on the creative side, get compensated?
Yes. I'll start with what hopefully is not a cop-out answer, but like a true answer is that it very much depends. I think one of the most exciting and also most challenging parts of being an artist or just working in the music industry is that there truly is no cookie cutter formula for like what does or doesn't work in terms of building an artist's career. That means that it's like very hard to find kind of tried and true playbooks for like, you know, building an artist strategy, but it also means that like truly the world is your oyster. Like culture moves quickly enough. I think you know, tech platforms have evolved enough that you can really find your niche and hone in on that niche as an artist. With all that said, I guess there are definitely a few core areas of the music industry to be aware of. So the bedrock of the music industry arguably is intellectual property or IP and owning copyright in music. There are two sides of the music copyright picture. I'll start with I guess publishing, which covers ownership of like the lyrics and the underlying melodies and harmonies behind a song. And so say that you own, you know, like a very, you know, classic rock catalog. On the publishing side, anytime someone covers that song, you are entitled to a share of royalties, of publishing royalties.
And in that instance, a song is defined as like the combination of music, melodies, harmonies, and lyrics. Like there's a definition of a song.
Yes, in like a music IP context, yes. I think of
Okay.
it, to use like a cooking analogy, almost as like the ingredients,
Okay.
the
Okay.
underlying ingredients and recipe. And then you have the recording side, which is more like the specific, for the most part, like static, I guess, implementation of those ingredients. So
Okay.
to take, let's say Pink Floyd, for example. If like
Right.
there's an original Pink Floyd song, and then someone today made like a separate cover of
Okay.
that song and recorded it, those would be two separate, I guess, two separate recordings on the
Hmm.
recording side, but they all are drawing from the same underlying ingredients, like
Okay.
lyrically, melodically, harmonically. So um, I guess, so with that, uh, in terms of like how you make money as an artist on the IP side,
Hmm.
um, the I think one of the most important and also most contested, um, or hotly debated sources of revenue in the music industry right now is streaming.
Right.
I think the vast majority, at least in the US, the vast majority of um, recording revenue is coming from streaming. The name of the game of that model, though, is scale. I
Right.
think the way that Spotify, for example, pays out streaming royalties to rights holders and artists is
Hmm.
what's called a pro rata model. So basically, at the end of every period, usually like a month or so, they divvy up subscription revenue or just revenue they have in general by market share.
Okay.
So naturally, the people or the labels that already have like really big market share will get the vast majority of those payments. So it's a very tough environment to operate in as an artist. It ends up on average, and it's always a moving target, but it's
Hmm.
a very low number, like around like a fraction of a penny per stream, like 0.00 $3 or something. So there's that side. Sorry, you're gonna.
No, 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 no. I'm there's so much to take away. I mean, just thinking about all the different pieces that come in and all the, but you're also thinking about like there's components that create an individual piece of music that gets copyright protection and some sort of protection. But then on the other side, it's all being done in the context of all the other music that's being played through these services.
Yes, exactly. And I think that there are lots of studies now, internationally, like governments are looking into streaming economics and just trying to get a better understanding of how it's impacted artists' livelihoods for better, but in many cases, arguably for worse. Like it's definitely made the landscape much more competitive from an emerging artist perspective. It can
Hmm.
definitely come across as a zero sum game. Um, but yeah, so there's like streaming on the recording side. On the, I guess, for both recording and publishing, just to give another example of a source of revenue for artists and songwriters, is something called synchronization licensing, or sync for short.
Okay.
And that just refers to music or audio being synced or placed in multimedia. So, say that you
Okay.
get your song placed in a podcast, in a Netflix show. There are tons of case studies of that. Most notably, Kate Bush, I believe, from
Oh yeah.
Stranger Things, had like a whole. Her career has, like, truly transformed because of like a really really good placement in a Stranger Things episode. So that is just another example of, I guess, using earning revenue from IP in a way that's not just about like consumption.
Yeah. It's
Yeah.
so interesting because there are a lot of parallels to the publishing industry, right? You've got um, a definition of the unit, right? Which, whether that's the article or the piece of intellectual property, a conversation, there's really this definition. Then there is some sort of compensation that's consumption based. And then there are additional ways that creators, to use the phrase broadly, can earn additional revenue from this IP. And similarly to what's going on in publishing, there are these massive intermediaries doing the distribution, right? It used to be that distribution was done by record stores, and now you've got this technological disruption of the distribution. Um, so talking about the publishing industry where we're coming from, our members, news and magazine journalism publishers, are in a fight right now to make sure they get fair compensation from the tech platforms. What do you think was key for the music industry to not end up kind of giving away the farm on the digital content and ultimately securing that appropriate licensing and compensation from the platforms?
Yes, I also will say I think important context is that the music industry and publishing industries, from my understanding, are different in terms of like what kinds of entities have leverage and why.
Yeah.
So in the music industry, at least on the like recorded music, the music
Hmm.
IP side, I believe it's around 80% market share any given year is taken up by three companies, three major
Okay.
labels. So it's a very, very tightly concentrated industry. Universal Music, Warner Music, and Sony Music are like the
Okay.
top three major labels, and they also own a bunch of like independent distributors. So they have just like a vast swath of millions of songs
Hmm.
worth of catalog. There's also I guess a trade body called the the Recorded Industry Association of America, or the
Okay.
RIAA for short. Because all major labels are involved in that, they also have enormous negotiating leverage, and they have definitely a reputation from the past few decades of just being very aggressive and like
Hmm.
litigating against tech companies like very very early on who were using catalogs without permission.
Interesting.
For example, I think probably it's very very rare to find this kind of action now, but I think when Napster was at its peak around the turn of the 21st
Yeah.
century, the RIAA started suing fans. And these were
Right.
like everyday people, like a grandma at home who was just like trying to trying to figure out how this worked. Yeah, just all ages, like teenagers, adults. And there's a ton of backlash against that practice. But if you look at like music and tech news, music industry news in the last few years, every single year there's kind of similar news like that. So like I think the equivalent trade body on the publishing side filed a lawsuit against Peloton for, I believe it was $200 million
Hmm.
for copyright infringement, just using their music
Hmm.
without permission. They had a similar lawsuit against Roblox, very popular gaming platform, in the last few years. So I guess that's one. So thinking about like macro industry structure and
Yeah.
power dynamics, I think like the notion of uh, a lot of like IP being concentrated in the hands of a few, uh, like a smaller handful of bodies is definitely something to
Yeah.
scrutinize, but has definitely helped, I think, uh, like lead to at least more favorable licensing terms for that side, for the IP side.
Hmm.
And I think now, like learning from like Napster, I think, oh yeah, the music industry in many ways is still like feeling the lingering residual effects of
Hmm.
piracy and how they did or did not deal with it. So at least what I'm noticing with like business development or innovation teams at these bigger labels and IP companies is just starting those conversations much earlier.
Interesting.
And I think there probably is a parallel in the publishing world. Yeah. So like, or just having like very frequent, more positive and like hopefully collaborative conversations with startups who want to use their catalog.
Yeah.
Um, having those conversations much early on, and like building out a long-term strategy where they're like proactively pursuing those collaborations with mutually favorable terms, hopefully, as opposed to ending up in a position where they have to be uh, purely reactive and purely just like suing companies, suing people, which
Right.
definitely is not a good place to be in financially, but also in terms of just like public perception
Yeah.
of the role of these companies.
It's funny, and not to sound too much like the core group millennial that I am, but how many both industries really the wounds of the sort of early 2000s and the way that the industries are still in many ways evolving, reacting to those, and how that's shaped where we find ourselves in 2023. So moving from sort of the past into sort of where we are now, let's talk about Web3, which I know is a major part of your work. What do you see as the potential for Web3, both in how creators get compensated as well as the creative potential for the technology for musicians and creators?
Yeah, I think maybe it would help to start with just like defining what Web3 is, because I also it's definitely it's become so widely talked about, and in many cases like widely adopted, that people have like very different definitions of like what it means. So
Yeah.
I'll just start with like my context on like how I think about it. So I think of Web3 in general as a suite of apps, online apps or experiences that are built on something called blockchain technology. And in terms
Mhm.
of understanding where Web3 really does add value, I think it does have to start at the foundation of like understanding what the technology is.
Mhm.
So blockchain technology at its core, it's just a decentralized, distributed way of storing and recording data, usually transaction data. So
Mhm.
by decentralized and distributed, it means that there's no one central um, entity or actor that controls it.
Okay.
So ideally, these networks become a lot more resilient. Like there are just multiple nodes in a network,
Mhm.
multiple computers that can like all access the same data.
Mhm.
So it's very so data is like much more transparent. The way that blockchain works also is that each transaction that is recorded is what's called immutable, which means that it cannot be changed or tampered with.
Yep.
If it has to be changed, there has to be agreement or consensus across the network to kind of change those transactions. Um, and there's also a notion of things being like I guess just much more verifiable, and also like
Mhm.
in how they're not able to be
Right. You've got
tampered with.
this distributed
Yeah.
set of data that no one can mess with, and it's just clear. Here is the change. Here is the transaction. Here's what happened.
Yes. I think a very important caveat to that also is that compared to what we're used to with quote unquote Web2 or traditional internet
Mhm.
applications, blockchain is slow. I think the tech is improving, but because it's much more distributed, and
Mhm.
because it requires a lot more like coordination, or like, across the network to like verify or approve transactions, it is a lot slower. I think the environmental element of it has definitely improved in the last few years, but it's just like it takes up time and therefore takes up resources. I bring that up because in terms of thinking about like the how Web3 actually benefits creative industries,
Mhm.
or how it benefits music in particular, yeah, which is something that at Water Music we've studied quite a bit. The primary benefit is in data
Mhm.
for now, and not in experience, at least from my
Okay.
view. Say so, like for example, if you're an artist who is trying to build like a very smooth, fun online experience, or like kind of like a virtual world thing, for example, that you want your
Sure.
fans to explore, there are blockchain enabled like platforms that allow for that.
Mhm.
But it's definitely like still pretty in a very like niche experimental phase
Mhm.
currently. And it's definitely not at like the kind of smoothness or performance level that you'd expect from like a traditional video game, for example.
Right. Right.
But like by say if you like mint an NFT, which or like not a non-fungible token,
Yeah.
which is kind of like a digital collectible, blockchain native digital collectible. If you mint that, and a fan or someone who follows you, like buys that NFT, the way blockchain works, you have that information forever. Like
Right.
I know artists. There's an artist, for example, named RAC. He's an
Okay.
independent electronic artist, and he's been like minting and experimenting with Web3 since probably 2015, 2016.
Oh, wow.
And so by the way blockchain works, like he has a permanent transparent record of anyone who's ever supported his work on
Interesting.
chain or on the blockchain throughout that time. And so from like a fan or like audience relationship management perspective, even just like having that transparent
Mm.
log and that transparent history of behavior and being able to tailor experiences or offerings, sorry, based on that history, I know is a huge benefit, because the at least in music, the alternative, or not the alternative, the status quo still is like actually not having that much transparency
Right.
into like what the fan or audience journey looks like, and like how a given fan actually has related to your work over time.
Right.
So yeah.
And again, there's intermediaries, whether it's the platforms where people are consuming the music, or the platforms where people are purchasing tickets, or the platforms, so that's all. It almost allows musicians to own that themselves.
Yes,
That
exactly. I
information.
think there are many parallels to the non Web3 technology of email. I think
Mhm.
there's we held our first conference a few weekends ago at Water and Music, and there was a conversation about like fan first tech. People were like,
Yeah.
what are your favorite fan first tech?" And like, yeah, two of the top answers I'm pretty sure were some emerging blockchain platforms and email. And I
Yeah.
think but I think those core principles of um, ownership. Another very important element, which is not unique to Web3, but definitely defines part of it, is interoperability. So
Okay.
being able to, or portability of data,
Hmm.
I should say. So being able to take whatever data you have, and because it is decentralized and because you have full access to it, being able to plug it into any other like blockchain
Sure.
powered application, which is a huge benefit to artists
Yeah.
at least. Yeah.
And it's so interesting because it's not actually about the creation, as you say. It's more about the data and what individual creators or groups could know about their audience. It's interesting. It leads in kind of to my next question: is one place where we are seeing a strong similarity between music as well as other creative industries, where the technology is right now, more potentially impactful on the creative side, is the rise of AI. The technology, which can be a tool certainly to help actual people create more, but there's that strong slippery slope argument that ends up with, computers fully being, computers fully replacing humans. What do you make of that thesis as a trained musician yourself? Do you think down the line all musicians are just going to be replaced by really talented robots?
I have many opinions on this, and I definitely have thought about it through multiple angles, both
Hmm.
in terms of like what will be automated away or not in music, and also like running a media company myself. I am
Yeah.
thinking about this in a very existential way. Like, our newsletter is still going to be relevant, like 5 years from now. So
Hmm.
I still think so for a few different reasons. Actually, let me step back a bit and go to music. So I think what I'm seeing in music, which I think can be applied to other creative industries as well, is there's definitely a philosophical rift in the landscape right now in terms of the motivation to even build, let alone sell and monetize or use these tools. Um, there's one field of people assuming in the products they're building that music is just a means to an end. So
Mm.
like music is just like a step in the process of doing something else. For example, playing music just as like background fodder for while you're working because you just need to
Right.
focus. So it's a means to an end of like being more productive. Or music, uh, you need music for your TikTok video. You don't
Right.
want to you don't want to think that much about like
Hmm.
song selection or worry about licensing.
Hmm.
So that's kind of one group, music as a means to an end. The second group is music as the end in itself, like music creation as like a much more kind of personal form of expression,
Right.
where it doesn't have like a purely functional use case, like to achieve something else. Like
Hmm.
you're doing it because you love the art and you get value out of the art. I think AI will have definitely a very like existential and directly like competitive kind of impact on that first group. So music as a means to an end. People who work in that area, harsh reality is they'll probably want to automate part of the music creation process away
Right.
because they just want to achieve something else like as quickly as
Hmm.
possible. So we're seeing a lot of AI apps that kind of automate like chill background music, and you kind of set
Hmm.
parameters for like the BPM or kind of the general tone you want.
Right.
Or there are a lot of like AI startups that are building specifically for like TikTok creators, Twitch streamers who don't
Right.
want to deal with copyright issues. But there are there's like a lot of the most exciting AI startups, at least for me personally, are in the second group. Like they're working with like professional artists and producers, but also amateur. But they're not
Yeah.
trying to replace them. That is much more an approach of like augmenting their creative process or complementing it, but still taking
Okay.
the assumption that the human artist is like still at the steering wheel
Mhm.
because that's like the value. That's where the value in music comes from. Is from that very like kind of human led expression,
Mhm.
much more kind of purely artistic in nature versus like more purely functional. Like I'm just trying to like get this piece of content out there. So it's I think that's a misconception that we found in our research, or just in terms of like, yeah, looking at public perception and like all the headlines about
Yeah.
will like robots replace artists. There's certain parts of the industry where I think that will happen, and it's like very important to like scrutinize those right now. But
Mhm.
there's a whole other school of thought where no, the goal was never to replace artists. Um, it's always been to kind of elevate their creative thinking to a whole other level and just allow them to make music that would not have otherwise been possible, and kind of boundary pushing in that way.
Yeah, and I also wonder too if music is contending with this technology because I mean, for over 100 years, a little bit more, right? We've had a similar idea, which is recorded music, right? For millennia, we only had live music, and then all of a sudden, you didn't have to have live music, and artists and creators, as well as music consumers, did figure out there is a value in my life for recorded music, but there is also value in my life for live performance, right across all genres. And so maybe that's a model for thinking about this new technology, which is about creation, but so is recording, right? I mean, the ability to record music certainly changed what pop music sounds like, even though maybe it didn't change what already existing classical music sounded like. But there's still value in performance.
Yeah, this was the like not the final, the very critical missing piece from what I was saying initially about like the economics of music or like being an
Yeah.
artist. Definitely so definitely a parallel that I've seen across music and publishing is that
Hmm.
like the media or the content itself has become fully commoditized.
Hmm.
And like the price of both creating and distributing it has gone down to
Yep.
basically zero. So
Hmm.
from at least from an individual artist's perspective, strategy perspective, building building a career just around that
Hmm.
is incredibly you're just thrown in an incredibly cutthroat environment from day one. And it's just like really, really hard to sustain a career off of that alone. So a
Hmm.
trend that we've seen on a macro level for sure is I guess an ongoing rise in revenue and also in like prices for tours. I think if you look at least the like a more kind of like commercial artist, an artist who has like mainstream Billboard chart topping
Hmm.
kind of ambitions, recording is like a small minority of the picture. Vast majority of revenue is going to come from touring, which has much higher margins, and then from other adjacent areas like merch is becoming an increasingly important revenue stream for a lot of artists as
Hmm.
well. So yeah, so with the rise of AI kind of further accelerating that like commoditization trend we're seeing,
Hmm.
and like just leading to an even noisier landscape for media in general.
Hmm.
I think the value of live experiences and just the kinds of experiences people want to seek out, and yeah, the value they'll place on it will continue to increase. I mean, hopefully it won't get as bad as like having to pay like $1,000 for a ticket or something. But
Right.
but in terms of like, yeah, from the artist perspective, how do you prove your humanity? How do you build trust with your fan base, with new fans or audiences? That becomes an increasingly critical part of the picture.
Yeah, and it's so relevant for publishing. From where I sit, to pay attention to what's happening in music. So I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about Water and Music, the organization you started as an organization. I think there's so much that companies and individuals can learn about developing collaborative innovation spaces. What are your thoughts on designing a landscape where people, who work in a similar industry, who pay attention to the same thing, can feel comfortable connecting with each other and sharing ideas?
Yes. This is definitely, again, like, super exciting, a huge part of why I do what I do, why we
Hmm.
do our work at Water Music, but also um, very challenging, of course, especially if you're dealing with like established industry structures and silos
Yeah.
where a metaphor I've heard or analogy I've used and heard a lot is like trying to like re-steer a cruise ship, like turn around a cruise ship. It's not gonna be a fast process at all. I think an approach that has worked for us to date is starting to establish that culture more from the ground up by focusing on like emerging tech trends and
Mhm.
involving that like long tail of developers, artists, founders, like really experimenting and building like the next generation of tools and apps for the music industry on the ground,
Yeah.
and involving them as the primary um, collaborators,
Yeah.
and I guess like and hopefully in the process, showing by example the kinds of insights that could be developed from that approach. And yeah, definitely a lot of my week to week now is showing like all that work that we've done now in the last like year and a half, and then now bringing them to bigger companies, bigger brands. I mean, like look at this body of work that we've done, look at the insights
Yeah.
we've been able to pull from this more collaborative crowdsourced approach. How can we help you do the same thing, or like how might you want to get involved as a contributor in sharing data? So yeah, I think so our approach has been bottom up, I think more for the better. But definitely in the music industry there are many historical attempts to share data that have fallen through, and I think
Hmm.
a big part of that has been because from day one they were trying to get consensus across among a lot of more like incumbent rights holders or companies, where to get them to change even like a tiny part of their process, let alone um, like convince them to share data and like convince them that that approach will like not make them lose market share with like all their other competitors.
Hmm.
It proved to be an immense challenge. Whereas like if you take a group of people or a group of companies that are a lot more nimble and are more open to experimentation, and realize the value of data sharing, and we've found that that tends to be more on like the entrepreneurship side,
Sure.
the and an artist side, like people who are scrappy because they have to be, and they and but also like they're trying to build networks themselves from the ground up as well. So there's mutual incentives at play there. So
Yeah.
yeah.
What it other than sort of being very selective and sort of how you're thinking about it, how you're talking about it, what are what are the obstacles that you see when people try and turn those cruise ships that you run into? Is it just it's too far, too fast? The boat really won't turn.
Yeah, I think so there was so a specific example I'm thinking about of like previous music industry attempts to drive this kind of change. There was something called the Global Music Rights Database that was
Hmm.
attempted around 2014, I think. And it was all the major labels, publishers, like music rights holders, trying to come together to establish what still doesn't exist in the music industry, which is a single source of truth for who owns what. Um,
Wow.
yeah, and like who owns what percentage. It is truly, there could be many podcast episodes like just about that issue. Very unglamorous, but critical issue, because
Sure.
then that leads to like all these like back and forth email chains or just like weird
Hmm.
payments because people can't figure out, what percentage, like how much of a song this person owns, and like
Wow.
making sure it's getting to them. So around 2014, um, a bunch of like the bigger rights holders were like, okay, let's try to solve this once and for
Hmm.
all. Let's uh, like let's all get together and like try to share this data.
Hmm.
Um, I think, and a lesson from that, and I think it applies to a lot of similar attempts in the music industry specifically, the technology is there to make it happen. So there's like
Mm-hmm.
there's a technical element of, all right, taking all these data sources, and using machine learning, most likely to kind of reconcile any gaps, among the data sets in terms of like
Sure.
ownership. Like that tech is definitely there. It ended up falling through for purely political reasons. I think
Got
it
it.
was, yeah, surprise, surprise. There were two major funders of the project who were rights holders who like backed out last minute because they were like, oh, this actually like might not make strategic sense for us. Probably like a read that a lot of people have is that, once that data gets out, probably the companies, people will realize that these companies like owe more money to more people than maybe they're
Got
make it
it.
out to be. And so that there's like some strategic advantage in like not being totally transparent. It's a read that just a lot of analysts have had on that debacle. But yeah, they burned through like $10 to $15 million, I'm pretty sure, in trying to build that. So yeah, I think for that kind of large scale music industry change around IP, where it
Mm-hmm.
is like controlled by a lot of these like slower, um, like much more bureaucratic bodies as well. Usually, the sticking point is political, and just like the reality that at least on that side, these companies see the market as like super competitive and just want to
Right.
maintain their position as best as possible. Yeah.
So interesting. So I know we've talked a lot about innovation and specific, developments today, but as we wrap up, what trends do you think are worth paying most attention to, both for music as well as other industries, that want to learn from music and not fall into that same trap of feeling you've lost out on revenue that's yours?
Yeah. Let me think. So yeah, we mentioned AI. That's been
Hmm.
I mean, it's hard. It's very hyped up right now, but I think it
Hmm.
is hard to overhype it because of how transformative I think it is in like starting from the point of like creation, like media creation, just
Yeah.
like that up truly
Hmm.
to anybody on like a much higher quality than we'd seen before. So I think that's a trend that I'm definitely following.
Hmm.
It's even been interesting to see. Um, okay, actually, this is the perfect media
Hmm.
example. I'm already noticing with like different policies that media companies are taking around AI.
Hmm.
It's very revealing for showing which side of the camp they're on in the sense of, or which camp they're in terms of media as a means to an end versus media as like the thing in
Right.
itself that like, for example, almost all the companies who have taken a very lean in approach to generating articles with AI,
Hmm.
usually have some other like business model around that. So CNET, for example, there's a huge investigation around them using AI tools.
Hmm.
Sorry, using AI tools to generate articles, but they have a big like affiliate model where they're just trying to get clicks to
Right.
other sites. BuzzFeed as well, um,
Hmm.
and they have some affiliate, also like general ad model around it. Whereas like Wired has been very like much more cautious. They're like,
Sure.
we will never use GPT, so at least they claim, to like write or
Hmm.
edit articles. Um, if that changes, we'll be very transparent about it. So that's one trend, just like AI following, especially how big brands are or are not incorporating this tech. Um, I think in music, there are also a lot of um, interesting startups coming up that are trying to um, automate the marketing process in a more strategic way, at least, especially for independent artists. So I guess there are a few elements. One is having clearer data on like who your audience is and how they
Hmm.
behave across multiple different platforms, because right now that data is still super fragmented. um, but then also then like being able to automate, or at least like using tools like AI, recommend how you should shape campaigns kind of early on as an artist based on your target audience, who other artists are, who you really like,
Yeah.
or want to collaborate with. So yeah, I'm seeing some very exciting developments on that front, and in general in terms of understanding where that's going, like aggregating and presenting data around fan or audience behavior in a much cleaner way. The fragmentation issue in music is bad enough right now that if/when that gets solved, I think that'll be a lesson for any other creative industry.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Cherie Hu. I just, there's so much to think about. There are so many parallels. Listening to you talk, my brain is going like a mile a minute thinking about what we can learn. So I appreciate so much you taking the time to speak with us, to bring us your perspective. For our listeners, if you have any thoughts, questions, or comments, you can reach me at rebecca@newsmediaalliance.org. And please, if you can, share the podcast with a friend or colleague. You can find us on the major podcast apps, YouTube, and our website, newsmediaalliance.org. Thank you again to my guest, Cherie Hu. You can find her at waterandmusic.com. Thank you for listening to News Take, and I will see you next time.